Okay, guys, this is the long one. It's still Jackson in America, and this is about the Jackson administration. This is the bulk of what you need to know out of Chapter 11. While I'm at it, band, you've got about 45 minutes till you perform. Whatever happens, I know you're going to make us proud. Go get them. All right. So let's get into Jackson and his personal way of doing things. We've already talked about the election of 1828 and what happened there. The Jackson way is how he characterizes himself, how he characterizes his administration. One of the first things Jackson does in office is he introduces this thing we call the spoils system. Sometimes it's also called patronage. But it's this concept that when you win political office, you give your supporters jobs that you have the power of appointment over. So Jackson is going to appoint his political supporters to positions of power within the government. And like I said, sometimes we call this thing patronage. Jackson himself called it rotation in office. He was not a fan of people that had been in office for long periods of time remaining in that office. He thought you needed new blood. That's the only way you can be more responsive to the people. In the actual political system, we might refer to this as term limits. There are some good things to this. Jackson definitely saw the good things to this, the benefits to it. Number one, you put your political supporters in positions of power, and they can help push your agenda, and they can make sure that people toe the party line and do what you want them to. The problems with the spoils system is you are appointing people simply because they helped your campaign. For instance, I don't know, maybe somebody raised millions of dollars for my presidential campaign, and in exchange I'm going to make them ambassador to, I don't know, Hungary or someplace like that. Jackson puts together this thing we call the kitchen cabinet. Now, you have the cabinet, which are the formal advisors, the guys that are in charge of all the executive branch departments. The kitchen cabinet were his unofficial advisors. Guys who were kind of like his friends, but they gave him advice on pretty much everything until about 1831. In 1831, he'll reorganize the cabinet because of this thing called the Peggy Eaton affair. This doesn't directly involve Jackson. This actually involves his Secretary of War, a guy named John Eaton. He marries this woman named Peggy, and she is rather loud. And the issue is the wives of the other cabinet members don't like her. And so they don't invite her to official functions. They will not have dinner with her and the Secretary of War. And it becomes this really social, stupid thing. And it ultimately turns political because Jackson sees what is happening and he associates it with what happened to his wife Rachel. He sees the same thing happening here. And so he, not only privately but also publicly, sides with the Eatons. In fact, at one point he'll host a function at the White House, and because there is no First Lady, he will ask Mrs. Eaton to stand next to him and kind of be the fill-in for the First Lady and force the wives of the cabinet officials to have to shake her hand and curtsy to her and show her social respect. This is going to cause the collapse of the entire cabinet. His entire cabinet resigns. Two of his cabinet officers that resign, they're actually loyal, are John Eaton. John Eaton will resign. And then also Martin Van Buren, who is the Secretary of State. They were very loyal to Jackson. Of course, John Eaton's on his wife's side. Martin Van Buren is also on Peggy Eaton's side. They resign, and Martin Van Buren looked at Jackson and said, I'm resigning because I want to give you the ability to start over with a brand new cabinet. Once they resign, Jackson then goes to the other members of his cabinet and demands their resignations. And of course, they'll give it to him. The only one that stayed on was the Postmaster General. So, obviously an important position. Question number one. In what ways did Andrew Jackson reflect the original ideas of the Democratic-Republican Party? Whoops, went the wrong way. Alright, some of the major issues in Jackson's term in office, and kind of doing the first term here. Some of these issues extend from the first term into the second term, so it's hard to find a natural break here. But this one's definitely in the first term. The Maysville Road. The Maysville Road was a toll road that was going to go all the way through Kentucky. And the problem for the business was they just didn't have enough money to finish it out. Well, Congress decided that this road was going to be a good thing. It was going to promote trade and commerce. And so Congress authorized funding for the business to help build this toll road through Kentucky. Jackson vetoed it. He vetoed it on the grounds that since it was only within Kentucky, it was not a part of interstate commerce. Interstate means between two or more states. And he said, therefore, it's unconstitutional. The Constitution says the national government can promote interstate commerce, not intrastate commerce. Trade within one state, which is what this would have been. And you could make the argument that even though the road is going to be through Kentucky, it will benefit people on both sides of Kentucky, but Jackson didn't see it that way, mostly because he did not believe that the national government should be using funds for internal improvements in one state. The next major issue in Jackson's administration was this thing called the Bank War. This has to do with the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson, with these old Jeffersonian beliefs about the bank, believed it was just like it's always been, unconstitutional, undemocratic, and elitist, and unresponsive to the people. Jackson also had a personal reason to hate the Second Bank of the United States. In 1828, it supported Adams and tried to get him elected, and so Jackson blames the bank for the death of his wife. In 1832, Congress will vote on this thing called the Recharter Bill. Henry Clay is going to be the National Republican candidate for president. He and the president of the Second Bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle, are trying to force a campaign issue. The bank is not supposed to be rechartered until 1836. They decide they will bring it to Congress now. The idea being that Congress will see the bank as a stabilizing force, a positive for the economy, and Congress will reauthorize the bank. It will then go to Jackson, and Jackson will veto it. And so that's exactly what happens. Congress passes the recharter, Jackson vetoes it on those grounds up above, and Henry Clay has an issue to run on in the election of 1832. Who do you want to be president? Me, Henry Clay, who is for a stable economy and for promoting a healthy environment, or Andrew Jackson, who wants to destroy the economy and make it to where your kids can't eat? And so it became the main issue in that election. And so in that election, the Democrats go ahead and they renominate Andrew Jackson. They change the vice president. Jackson's vice president had been John C. Calhoun. But as we'll see in a minute, John C. Calhoun was trying to undermine the authority of the government. And so they replaced John C. Calhoun with Martin Van Buren. The National Republicans turn around and they nominate Henry Clay, as expected. And they run a campaign. This campaign is unlike the election of 1828. This one is mostly based on issues. Now, they still say things about each other, but mostly we pay attention to the issues in this one. What are your feelings on internal improvements? What are your feelings on the national bank? Should we support industry or should we support agriculture? And in the end, Jackson wins re-election. Jackson is the man of the people. Jackson is the common man. And so the voters continue to support him. Question number 2, based on the cartoon, what did Jackson's opponents believe about his use of presidential power? To help you with the cartoon, we have here Andrew Jackson, dressed not like a president, but instead like something else. I don't want to give it away to you. Here on the margin is a veto memory. Here they name him King Andrew the First. Over here, had I been consulted, and that should probably be an ellipsis afterwards. Up at the top, you can't see it. There's another line that says he was born to command. And so you have him here holding a scepter, and over here in his other hand of power, he holds the veto. And in case you can't tell, down here at the bottom, what is it he's stepping on? What is it that's torn into pieces? You have the Constitution of the United States, you have internal improvements, you have the U.S. Bank. More issues in Jackson's second term. The death of the second Bank of the United States carries right on with the bank war. After the election of 1832, Jackson believed he had a mandate from the people. The people had said that they were okay with his policies, and so he ordered the removal of all federal funds immediately from the Bank of the United States. His Secretary of the Treasury actually refused. He told him that was a stupid idea, and so Jackson fired him. Replaced him with the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, who also refused to remove the funds from the bank, and so Jackson fired him too, until he found some spineless yes man who finally did it. And when they removed the funds from the second Bank of the United States, they took the funds and they spread them around. They spread them around to these things that we call the pet banks, regional and state banks, who were on a more local level, who were going to get a sudden infusion of cash, and would then be able to loan that money out to the public. They would be able to loan it out to small farmers. They would be able to loan it out to the common man. And this should be something that creates economic stimulation. Instead, these pet banks loaned money out without checking the credit risk of whoever it was they were loaning money to. And it caused inflation, it caused speculation. Speculation is when you purchase something hoping the price will go up, and then you'll turn around and sell it and try to make money. And ultimately it led to this thing called the Panic of 1837, but by that point Jackson won't be president, and so the blame won't fall on him, it will fall on his successor. This is the way this is the way Democrats saw the destruction of the Bank of the United States, though. Okay? Here is Andrew Jackson holding the order for the removal of the public monies deposited in the bank. And here are the evil bankers, Nicholas Biddle and his moneyed interest, and Henry Clay. And look, even here, someone else who is involved in the bank. Question number 3. What was the nullification crisis, and how can it be seen as a prelude to the Civil War? The nullification crisis technically has its beginnings before Jackson was even president. It has its beginnings with this thing that Congress passed called the Tariff of Abominations. The Tariff of Abominations officially was called the Tariff of 1828. The South referred to it, though, as the Tariff of Abominations. An abomination is something whose very existence is an affront to the eyes of God. So, in other words, it means bad. The South protested the tariff, and in 1832, Congress replaced it with the Tariff of 1832, which actually lowered tariff rates, but they were still too high for South Carolina. Both of these tariffs were protective tariffs. That meant they were designed purposely to make foreign goods more expensive than the American-made goods, which would protect American businesses and American industry from foreign competition. Now that hurts farmers typically because it makes the goods they have to purchase more expensive, and in response foreign countries will raise tariffs on American goods being sold overseas, and by the 1820s that's cotton. And so South Carolina responded with something called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. It was a document written by, at that point, Vice President of the United States John C. Calhoun, where he came up with this idea called nullification. Nullification got its roots with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, where Thomas Jefferson had come up with the idea of interposition. Interposition, as Jefferson defined it, was the state refusing to enforce a law that was illegal, that violated the people's rights. John C. Calhoun's nullification goes a step further. To him, nullification was the ability of a state to refuse to enforce a law passed by the national government if, in some way, it hurt the citizens of that state. It doesn't talk about whether or not it's violating their rights. It just talks about it is a detriment to the people of that state. So if it hurts them economically, according to John C. Calhoun, the state can refuse to enforce that law. And so, using this doctrine of nullification, once Jackson is president, South Carolina in 1832 nullifies both tariffs. They refuse to collect them, and they forbid anyone in the state to collect those tariffs after February 1st of 1833. So they refuse to enforce a federal law, and not only that, they refuse to allow anyone else to enforce that federal law. And then they also said that if the national government tried to use force against South Carolina, if the national government was going to try to force them to collect the tariff anyway, they felt that that was grounds for secession. And so all in late 1832, early 1833, people are asking this question, can South Carolina secede? South Carolina and John C. Calhoun, of course, are going to say yes. Andrew Jackson is going to say absolutely not. And so Andrew Jackson, after South Carolina nullified the tariff and after South Carolina warned against the use of force, Jackson orders all military forces in South Carolina placed on alert and to be prepared to forcefully collect the tariff. He goes to Congress and got Congress to pass this thing called the Force Bill. The Force Bill would have given Jackson the authority to let the military in South Carolina collect the tariff. If Jackson uses the Force Bill, if Jackson uses the military to try to collect the tariff, South Carolina will respond by sending their militia against the military. Someone may start shooting. In that case, Jackson will be forced to call up the army, and Jackson will be forced to go to the states of the country and say, I need you to send soldiers to put down the rebellion in South Carolina. And several of the states in the South are looking to South Carolina to see if South Carolina is going to be able to get away with this. South Carolina is not the only state that doesn't like the tariffs. South Carolina is just the first one to say, we refuse to collect it. Everyone else is waiting to see what happens before they decide whether or not they want to collect it. Fortunately, cooler heads prevail. Along comes Henry Clay, again. And he comes up with this thing called the Compromise Tariff, or the Tariff of 1833. Basically what they do is they find out what level of tariff South Carolina would be comfortable with, and they lower tariff rates down to that point. At this point, South Carolina has a tariff that they feel they can enforce, that it's okay with them, and so they rescind their nullification of the tariffs. Yes, we will now collect the tariffs now that they are at an acceptable level. They then turn around and nullify the Force Act. The purpose of the Force Act is to allow the president to use force to collect the tariff if South Carolina won't. Well, South Carolina's already said they're going to collect the tariff. The Force Act has no purpose. And yet South Carolina nullifies it anyway. Jackson doesn't care because he doesn't need it. The reason South Carolina nullified the Force Act was to keep this idea of nullification alive. They can always point to, look, we nullified the Force Act, and you will see that Jackson did not use force against us. Clearly, nullification works and is a viable option. Question number 4. How would you characterize Jackson's policy toward Native Americans? And when you're giving this answer, we're looking for a brief explanation of the answer, but it at least needs to, be in a complete sentence, right? So, Jackson's Indian policy. Jackson's history with the Native Americans is pretty much not good. He has been in several wars. The Creek War, which happened actually kind of during the War of 1812, in the late 18 teens. He's involved in the Seminole War. And while he is president, Congress is going to pass this thing called the Indian Removal Act. It's actually passed in 1830. The purpose of the Indian Removal Act is to move Native Americans out of the eastern portion of the country to the western side of the Mississippi River. Now, there are some people who say that Jackson was a supporter of this. And there are some people that say Jackson was a supporter of this because he did not feel that Anglo culture and Native American culture could coexist. And the reason he backed this was because he truly believed that Native American culture needed to be protected. And if you removed them beyond the Mississippi River, they would be in an environment where they would not be harmed by the Anglos. There's a Greek word for this. It's called baloney. Jackson doesn't like Indians. Jackson wants to force the Indians west of the Mississippi because he doesn't want them living in our society. Okay, that's my opinion. But you can look at history. You can look at the facts. You can read about it. It's probably right. Officially, this Indian removal policy could be directed at any Native American group. But the ones they're really looking at, the ones they're really trying to force out, are this group called the Five Civilized Tribes. The Five Civilized Tribes are the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and the Seminole. We call them the Five Civilized Tribes because these tribes, they're not the typical Hollywood Native Americans. They're not guys that live in teepees. They're not, running around half naked all the time. These are tribes who, when they encountered other cultures, they found the aspects of that culture that they felt would benefit them, and then they adopted it. And so I'll use as the example, I'll use the Cherokee, as I've had more examples with them, but you'll see in a second that when we remove the Native Americans, we're not going through and we're not kicking over cabins and we're not burning teepees. We are kicking in the front doors of people's houses, telling them to pack up their silverware and their fine clothes in whatever suitcases they have in the house, and telling them to load the wagon and move. And so that becomes even more problematic. So like I said, I'm going to use the Cherokee as my examples, as I've had more experience with them. All Native American groups are recognized as separate nations living within the United States. Think of the reservation as an independent country just surrounded by the United States, much like Lesotho is surrounded by South Africa. With the Cherokee, the state of Georgia, where a lot of the Cherokee live in Georgia, and the state of Georgia decided in the early 1800s that we're going to void the treaties and laws that had been made between the Cherokee Nation and the United States government, and the laws that were passed by the United States government to try to protect the Cherokee. And so the state of Georgia is essentially doing what South Carolina wanted to do in the nullification crisis. And actually, the state of Georgia is doing it sooner rather than later. And so South Carolina had actually gotten their inspiration for the nullification from Georgia after what happens with the Cherokee. Well, the Cherokee didn't like what the state of Georgia was doing, so the Cherokee did what we all do when something happens that we don't like. They sued. That's right. They hired lawyers, and they went to court, and they sued, and they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee. In the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that states were unable to regulate the Native Americans because the Native American tribes were characterized in the Constitution as domestic dependent nations. And a state cannot regulate another country. In the case of Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that only the national government had jurisdiction over the Native American tribes. Only the national government could create rules and restrictions for those tribes as outlined by the Constitution. This is still John Marshall's court. And John Marshall is taking a very active role for the national government. He's saying that this is a national government power. And ultimately, it didn't matter. In the case of Worcester versus Georgia, Andrew Jackson, when he found out that the state of Georgia had lost that case, Andrew Jackson's remark was, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." A clear indication that Andrew Jackson had no plans to enforce federal power, that Andrew Jackson was going to let Georgia do whatever it wanted with the Native Americans. And that's actually what South Carolina was waiting on before they did their nullification of the tariffs. All this ultimately, the persecution by Georgia, the Indian Removal Act, it all leads to this thing called the Trail of Tears. When the Native Americans, those 5 civilized tribes, were forced out of their lands into this place called Indian Territory, which we now know today as Oklahoma. Basically, they moved in 3 groups. The first group to go out were the group that we would call the collaborators. They worked with the government, said, yes, we will do this. Their plan was to be the first ones into the Indian Territory and then take political power and run the tribes. The rest of the Indians are going to fight the idea of removal. Some, led by a guy named John Ross, they actually sued the government over the issue of Indian removal, and again, they won. And knowing Andrew Jackson the way he did, John Ross said, even though we have won, we are going to be forced to move, and we can move on our own terms, or we can wait until they force us out. And he and this second group of Cherokee, they moved out. They were the ones that kind of accepted it was inevitable, and they had to move before it got worse. In the first elections in the Indian Territory, John Ross and his people, and that second group, they will win because they are, the more honest, hard-working group. The third group to move are the ones that were forced out, the ones that we might really think of as being on that actual Trail of Tears, where the military went in and, like I said before, kicked in the doors to people's houses and forced them to move. Several people in the military had a problem with this. One of them was the general who was in charge of this, guy named Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was assigned to remove the Cherokee. And he privately has reservations about what he is being asked to do, but because he is a military officer, because he has his orders, he will do it, and he will move the Cherokee. Hey, this is a map that shows the routes that they all took to get there. Most of the forced removal happens actually in the winter months, which is going to be just that much more devastating for the Native Americans who have to go on this journey. Okay. So there actually is a fourth group of these Native Americans. There actually is a fourth group. They're not all rounded up, particularly the Cherokee. Some of the Cherokee escape into the mountains here. This is the Appalachian Mountain Range right here. And so there are still Cherokee who live in North Carolina, who they're the descendants of people who were not removed because they were able to get into the woods and get into the mountains and hide where the government couldn't get them. Other issues from Jackson's presidency, these are going to be things I'll go over very quickly. In 1836, Texas became independent from Mexico, and Texas immediately asked to be annexed by the United States. That was going to cause a problem because Texas wanted to be a slave state, and there's no free territory ready to become a state yet, and so Texas annexation was put off. Another thing that happens during Jackson's term is Congress passed this thing called the Gag Rule. The Gag Rule was a rule. It was part of the congressional rules on how we're going to debate bills. The Gag Rule said any bill dealing with the abolition of slavery was to be automatically tabled. That means you walk in as a congressman, you introduce the bill, and it is automatically put off to the side, never to be discussed. Jackson also got Congress to pass this thing called the Specie Circular. Specie is the physical metallic money that we used to have our currency based on. Our currency used to be based on gold, and specie was the actual gold coins that were used as opposed to paper money. Jackson, as a way to, he thought, control inflation, wanted to require that all land purchased from the federal government be paid for in actual gold and silver coins rather than paper money. He thought this would help solve inflation. Instead, what it's going to do is it is going to cause people to try to hoard their gold and silver because they know if they turn it over to the government, they're never going to get it back. It also caused the paper money that was in circulation to become worthless because why would I take paper money from you when I cannot pay the government in anything other than gold or silver? And it actually caused a collapse in the sale of federal land. Federal land sales went from $20 million before the Specie Circular to just within a couple of years afterwards, $3 million. So huge percentage loss there. The other thing that happens in Jackson's second term is the creation of another political party, the Whigs. The National Republicans go away, and they'll be replaced by the Whigs. The Whigs take their name from a political party in Britain that was typically opposed to the actions of the King of Britain. And so they take the Whig Party because they are going to oppose the actions of who they referred to as King Andrew. The Whigs were made up of old national Republicans, so, old Federalist ideas. They'll have those ideas mixed in with them. But they're also made up of anti-Jackson Democrats. People who believed everything Jackson believed in. People who supported all of Jackson's policies. But they absolutely hated Andrew Jackson. Because, to him, political opposition was personal opposition. And when he took things personally, he took things out on you. And so you might support all of his policies, but you hated the man because of his attitude. That's been all. I hope this one was a little bit shorter than the Jefferson and Madison ones. Good luck.